Welcome to the IP camera hacking course from Hackers Arise. I'm OTW, as you know. And in the next 3 days, we're going to be looking at a variety of ways that these IP cameras can be hacked. This is the second version of this course. We've made some improvements and some changes to the version 1. Hopefully you like this one even better. In this case, what we'll be doing in this class, maybe as in contrast to the previous class, is that we want to look at the multiple ways that these cameras can be hacked, right? So all of these cameras, there's literally hundreds of manufacturers, right? There's a few who dominate, like Hikvision or Dahua. These are huge companies, Chinese-based, and but each of these cameras, even the different cameras by the same manufacturers, are going to be compromised in different ways. Right? So one of the things that I want to do in this class is to talk about the multiple ways that these cameras can be compromised. And one of the reasons you want to do this, or I want to do this at least, is that whenever there's a exploit that appears on the market and appears wherever, it's only good for a certain amount of time until the cameras get patched, until the manufacturer decides to go ahead and release a patch, and then the end user applies the patch. Right? But there's always ways to get into these systems. And so what I want you to come away from this class is look at the multiple ways that these cameras can be compromised, and then either develop your own or look at different ways. So at the same camera, and look at multiple ways that it might be compromised. So it's not about one tool, okay, and one exploit. It's about the process, okay, of hacking these cameras. And to our benefit, okay, and that's to the manufacturers, is that these cameras tend to be relatively simple, right? They're almost all, I could probably say, I think I can say all, right? All based upon a small Linux kernel. They're running a very small Linux operating system. And, otherwise, if they were to run a Windows operating system or a Mac operating system, the licensing right for the operating system would cost more than the camera does, because sometimes these cameras are less than $50, right, each. And so a license for any other operating system is going to be prohibitive. So they're almost all, I'm reluctant to say all, but almost all Linux operating systems. And they're relatively simple. And the companies crank these things out by the millions. And they're not really thinking about the security of the cameras. They are just trying to sell cameras. And that becomes really clear when you begin to look at the ways that these cameras can be compromised. Nobody who was really thinking about security would have done some of the things that they do here. Some of the compromises of these cameras are like what you would use 20 years ago in a traditional IT environment, website, what have you. So they're relatively simple. There's a lot of problems with authentication, and that's usually one of the biggest issues, is being able to have a secure authentication. And there's a lot of the exploits take advantage of that poor authentication mechanism. And we'll talk more about that as we go on. So this is actually a picture from Ukraine. And this whole IP camera hacking course grew out of a request by the officials in Ukraine who came to us, I think, about 2 months after. I can go back and check my emails. about 2 months after the war started, and they gave us a long list of cameras in Ukraine, and they said, could you go ahead and hack these for reconnaissance and surveillance? And so that's how this all came about. This is just one of many, many pictures that we captured. We have pictures from all over Ukraine. One of the biggest issues that we had was with some of the cameras is when the Russians would come in, they'd knock out the electricity and they'd knock out the internet access. So without electricity or internet access, the cameras really don't do you much good. So some of the areas that we had cameras in, we lost because of electricity or lack of internet access. We had a whole bunch in Odessa that got knocked out in a rocket attack in Odessa. So anyways, that's where this comes from. Why IP camera hacking? Okay, the obvious answer is for spying and surveillance, such as we did in Ukraine and Russia. Right? But one of the lesser known areas of IP camera hacking, and one that we're seeing a lot having an impact upon corporate environments, is that they also can be used for proxying. So remember, these are IP cameras, okay? They're connected to the internet and they have a Linux operating system. So if you can compromise the camera, if you can compromise the operating system, you can use it to proxy, okay? And you can go ahead and use a whole bunch of these cameras to be able to create a proxy chain and remain anonymous. Also, and we've seen this a lot as well, you can create a botnet for DDoS and password cracking, or whatever you want to do with your botnet, right? Oftentimes, probably the most common use of the botnets are for DDoS attacks, right? So if you can go ahead and compromise, 1 million cameras, and that is not outside the realm of possibilities, right? Because there's so many cameras out there, right? And then once you have that botnet, you can use it for attacking others, okay? Or use it for password cracking. Remember the password cracking, especially when we're talking about just trying to generate a lot of hashes, right? To try to match a hash. It's basically a brute force type of exercise, and the more machines you have, the faster it goes. So if somebody has a password that your CPU will take 8 years, okay, to go ahead and crack, if you have a million CPUs in all these cameras, you can get it down to a few hours, right? It's also important that if someone has control of the camera on your network, they likely have total control of your network, right? So if you have a camera inside of your network, right, that makes an easy pivot point for an attacker to be able to get inside your entire network. So this is not just about being able to watch people who don't want to be watched or secretly watching people. This is serious cyber war surveillance, proxying, and botnet, and protecting the entire enterprise network, right? Okay, as I said earlier, this class grows out of a project begun when the Ukrainian army asked us, Hackers Rise, to hack IP cameras throughout Ukraine to watch the Russians as they were invading Ukraine in early 2022. I think it was April 2022 is when that came to. So it was 2 months after the war started. We accepted and complied with their request, and in addition, began to hack cameras in Russia as well. Let's take a look at some of those images. Well, we'll look at some of those images a little later, right? Okay, many of the techniques we will demonstrate in this class are illegal in many countries. Only try them on cameras you have permission access. This is for educational purposes only. Okay, so we're not trying to induce you to do illegal activities, right? This is if you're in control of the network, if your job is to make sure the network is safe, you want to test those IP cameras and see whether or not they're hackable, right? So that somebody else can't compromise them. if you're in a cyber war environment, certainly hacking the adversary's cameras is going to give you some advantage to be able to watch what they're up to. The Kerch Bridge is, as you know, is a big bridge that goes between Russia and Ukraine, and it's a big supply point. It goes to Crimea, and by being able to watch the traffic on that bridge, you could tell what Russia was going to do next, because that was their main supply route, right? So anyway, let's move on. Let's talk about what today we're going to be working on introduction, okay? We'll be looking at the basics of IP cameras. We'll look at how to find them, and then we'll look at the RSTP protocol. RSTP protocol is the protocol that's used for most of these cameras. Not all of them, but most of them. Right? Day 2, tomorrow, we'll look at some scripts and exploitation. We'll look at the Foscam cameras, one of the many manufacturers, Dahua, Hikvision, Avtech, and some other manufacturers as well. And day 3, we'll look at developing your own zero-day exploit for IP cameras, right? As I always say, and I'll say it again, it's always advisable to start your compromise attempts beginning with the simplest and advancing to the more complex. That's exactly what we're going to do in this class, right? So if it wouldn't make any sense for you to go ahead and take weeks, months, years to develop your own zero-day if the camera you want to attack has default passwords in it, right? That's simply not an efficient way of using your time, right? So let's always start. And you could probably say this in most pursuits in life. You start with the simplest first, and then move on to the more complex and more difficult. If you're an automobile mechanic, right, and the car won't start, you don't assume that it needs a new engine, okay? You don't assume you say, go replace the engine, when probably all it needs maybe is a battery, or even not even a battery. Maybe there's just a bad connection, right? Maybe there's a fuse out, something that costs $2, right, versus a new engine. So that's kind of the way, that's my approach to hacking as well. Start with the simplest, okay, and move on to the more difficult and more complex. And that's the way we designed this course. All right, let's talk about CCTV versus IP cameras. All right, here's the old style analog CCTV. I put this out there because I think that when I ran the first class, I got a lot of questions from people who didn't really understand how these camera systems work. So I'm just trying to put a little bit more into this class about how they actually function. So here's the old analog CCTV. You got cameras, you got a DVR, you got a power box, right? And these are all hardwired, okay? Now, in a modern system, right, IP surveillance, and in some cases, the analog CCTV is not necessarily obsolete. A lot of companies still use them. In some ways, they are more secure, right? Once you put something on the internet and anybody can reach it, then all kinds of things can happen. But this is where most of the cameras are going to now, is to these IP type cameras. We got multiple cameras. We got a power over Ethernet switch. Okay. In some cases, and that would be, if we're using Ethernet, or we could use Wi-Fi as well. Right? It doesn't have to be power over Ethernet. It could simply be a wireless connection. And then we have a recording device here. Right? And then for our purposes, once again, for our basic IP camera setup, you can see there's a couple of cameras, right? Internet router. This is a PoE switch, but once again, it doesn't have to be. It could be very well simply be that the cameras are simply plugged in into a wall socket, and get their power that way as well. Obviously, if you use PoE, power over Ethernet, you don't have to have a separate connection for power.